On a warm, breezy afternoon, Marcus sat outside on his porch, watching the sun slowly set over his land. His farm had always been a peaceful place, the place where he found comfort after long, busy days. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had worked hard over the years to make it a home for his family. There were rows of crops in the field, a few animals running around, and the unmistakable smell of fresh earth in the air. For Marcus, this farm was a reflection of his life, hard-working, calm, and built with care. But not everyone in the neighborhood felt the same way about Marcus's farm. As Marcus sat there, enjoying the cool breeze, he didn't realize that a situation was about to unfold, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the quiet little community he called home. Carolyn, one of his neighbors, was a vocal member of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She lived just a few houses down, and everyone knew her as the kind of person who believed in enforcing every little rule to the letter. Whether it was the height of the grass on someone's lawn or how many flowers were planted in a garden, Carolyn was always ready to step in and correct what she saw as a violation of the community's standards. For months, Carolyn had been eyeing Marcus's farm with disapproval. She didn't like the way he arranged his tools in the open, the way the animals sometimes wandered close to the road, or even the way his property wasn't as neat as others in the area. In her eyes, Marcus's farm was a blight on what she believed should be the perfect neighborhood. No one had asked her to police the property of others, but she took it upon herself to do so anyway. One day, after walking down the street and casting a critical eye over Marcus's farm, Carolyn couldn't take it any longer. She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and made the call. "I'm calling about a man on the farm down the street," Carolyn said, her voice tense and stern. "He's causing a disturbance. His property is a mess. It's ruining the look of our neighborhood. Something needs to be done about it." The dispatcher on the other end of the line asked for details, but Carolyn wasn't interested in discussing specifics. All she knew was that Marcus's farm didn't fit into her vision of what the neighborhood should look like, and she wasn't going to let it go. She believed she had every right to call for help, even though there wasn't really any real danger or emergency. Back on his porch, Marcus continued to enjoy the quiet of the afternoon. He didn't think much about his neighbors' complaints. In his eyes, he wasn't doing anything wrong. His farm was just a reflection of his hard work and his life. But as he sat there, lost in thought, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching in the distance. At first, Marcus thought maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding. There were plenty of times when people didn't quite understand what he was doing. Sometimes, he had neighbors stop by asking questions, but it was never anything serious. Still, when the sirens grew louder and the cars came into view, Marcus stood up, his heart rate picking up slightly. He walked toward the driveway, curious to see what was happening. The officers stepped out of their cars, looking confused but alert. They looked around, taking in the sight of Marcus's land. The calm they expected to find didn't match the scene they had imagined from the 911 call. But there they were, standing in front of his property, uncertain about what to do next. Marcus greeted the officers with a calm smile, hoping to defuse the situation. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked. The officers glanced at each other and then at Marcus. "We received a call about some disturbances in the neighborhood," one officer explained. "We just need to check things out." Marcus wasn't angry or upset. He had dealt with similar situations before, neighbors who didn't understand or appreciate his way of life. But he also knew that this was different. This wasn't just a casual complaint about his garden, this was something more serious. Carolyn had called the authorities, and now they were here, expecting trouble. As the officers continued to ask him questions about his farm, Marcus remained calm and patient. He explained that he was simply living his life, working the land, and doing what he loved. He wasn't causing any harm, and he wasn't breaking any laws. but the officers seemed to be focused more on the call they had received than on Marcus's explanation. Just then, Carolyn arrived, her face a picture of determination. She stormed over to the officers, pointing at Marcus as though she had already judged him. "This man's property is an eyesore," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the field. "He's ruining the look of our community. You have to do something about it." Marcus turned to face her, but he didn't respond immediately. He knew this was where things could get tense. Carolyn had always been one to voice her opinions, but now, her words were accusing, filled with anger and frustration. She had painted him as the villain in her story, and the officers were caught in the middle, unsure of who was right. The officers listened, their faces blank as Carolyn continued her complaints. She went on about how Marcus's farm was a distraction and how it didn't belong in the neighborhood. It was clear to Marcus that Carolyn had made up her mind long before calling the police. She wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story. As the conversation grew more heated, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about his farm, it was about something bigger. Carolyn wasn't just upset about his farm, she was making assumptions based on her own prejudices and perceptions of who Marcus was. Marcus could feel the tension building. The officers were still standing there, unsure of how to respond, while Carolyn ranted on. He took a deep breath and realized that he had to act. If things were going to settle down, he needed to show Carolyn and the officers who he really was. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. The officers' eyes widened, and Carolyn stopped mid-sentence. Marcus held the badge up for them all to see. "I'm an FBI agent," he said calmly, his voice steady. Carolyn's face went pale as she processed what Marcus had just revealed. The words hung in the air as the officers stared in stunned silence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Carolyn, on the other hand, had just made one of the biggest mistakes of her life. The story was no longer just about a complaint. It was about respect, assumptions, and how easily misunderstandings could escalate. But Marcus wasn't interested in making a scene. He wasn't there to shame anyone, he was simply standing his ground, showing that appearances could be deceiving. The atmosphere had changed in an instant. The officers, once standing with uncertainty, now exchanged glances as they took in Marcus's revelation. Carolyn, still standing a few feet away, was frozen, her face pale with shock. The words Marcus had just spoken echoed in the quiet air, and the realization hit her hard. This wasn't just a simple disagreement about a farm and its appearance. The man she had called to have removed from the neighborhood wasn't just any farmer. He was an FBI agent. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and the only sound was the distant hum of a tractor in the fields. The officers, though trained to handle all kinds of situations, clearly didn't know what to do next. Marcus stood calmly, allowing the moment to sink in. He wasn't looking for an apology from Carolyn, he wasn't even looking for a confrontation. He simply wanted to clear the air and show that he had every right to be there. Carolyn stood there, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. She had thought she was in the right. She had believed that her position on the HOA gave her the authority to make decisions for everyone in the neighborhood. But now, standing before Marcus, she realized that she had overstepped. She had called 911 on a man who could easily have been someone far more powerful than she ever imagined. Finally, Carolyn cleared her throat, her voice shaky as she spoke. I didn't know," she muttered, her eyes flicking nervously between Marcus and the officers. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus nodded slowly, but his expression remained neutral. "That's the problem," he said softly. "You made assumptions without knowing the full story." The officers, still unsure how to proceed, looked at each other. They had been trained to handle a wide variety of situations, but this one was different. They had arrived expecting to resolve a petty neighborhood complaint, not to find themselves in the middle of an embarrassing misunderstanding. One of the officers finally spoke up, his tone professional but cautious. "Mr. Marcus," he said, addressing him directly. "I'm sorry for the confusion. We were just responding to the call." "I understand," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "I don't hold it against you. But you should know that Carolyn made a mistake, and now we all have to deal with the consequences." Carolyn shifted uncomfortably, her hands nervously folding and unfolding. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had made the call to 911, but she hadn't expected this kind of outcome. She had expected the officers to side with her, to see Marcus as just another farm owner breaking the rules. But now, everything had changed. "I'm sorry," she finally muttered, looking directly at Marcus. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to make the neighborhood better." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to shrink under the weight of her own words. Marcus didn't immediately respond. He understood the pressure people like Carolyn often felt to maintain an image of perfection in their communities. But that didn't excuse her actions. The people around him needed to understand that assumptions could lead to far-reaching consequences, and not just for the people being targeted but for everyone involved. "Making the neighborhood better doesn't mean controlling others," Marcus said, his tone firm yet calm. "It means understanding and respecting the boundaries and rights of everyone who lives here. I work hard every day to maintain this land, and I don't need someone else's judgment on how I should live my life." The officers, who had been silent until now, nodded in agreement. They could see the wisdom in Marcus's words, and though they still had to do their job, they could sense that the situation had already diffused. They weren't going to take further action against Marcus. In fact, they seemed to be more concerned with Carolyn's behavior now. "I think we've all learned something today," one officer said, his voice calming. "We'll make sure this is handled properly, but we're not here to escalate things further." Carolyn's face flushed, and she nodded quickly, looking down at the ground in embarrassment. She had wanted to be the one in control, the one who could dictate how things should be. But now, she realized that she had misjudged the situation completely. Her authority in the HOA hadn't given her the right to make assumptions or to bring the police into something that wasn't truly an issue. Marcus, sensing that Carolyn was genuinely remorseful, decided not to press the matter further. He didn't want to cause her more distress than necessary. Instead, he took a step back and smiled politely, hoping to ease the tension that had been building up. "You've learned your lesson," Marcus said, his tone gentle. "And I'm sure this won't happen again." Carolyn nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and relief. She had thought she was doing the right thing by calling the police, but now she understood that her actions had caused more harm than good. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again," she promised quietly. The officers, after a few more moments of discussion, turned to leave. They had done their job, and now it was up to everyone involved to move forward. As the squad cars pulled away, Marcus returned to his porch, his mind already drifting back to the quiet of his land. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, he knew who he was, and that was enough. As for Carolyn, she lingered in the driveway for a moment longer, staring at Marcus's farmhouse in silence. She had learned a hard lesson that day, one she would never forget. In her desire to maintain control, she had almost ruined a good man's day. But now, she realized that sometimes, it's better to let go of the need for control and simply respect others for who they are. Marcus, for his part, had no ill will. He didn't need an apology from Carolyn. He didn't want to dwell on the past. He simply wanted to go back to what he knew best, working his farm, taking care of his land, and living his life in peace. As the sun set lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields, Marcus felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had stood his ground, not with anger or resentment, but with quiet strength. And that, he knew, was the best way to handle any situation that came his way. For now, the neighborhood had learned an important lesson. And as for Marcus, he had learned that sometimes, it's not about proving who's right or wrong, it's about standing firm in your beliefs, no matter what anyone else might think. The following days after the confrontation were quiet, and the air around Marcus's farm seemed a little more still. As much as he appreciated the peace and tranquility of his farm, the events that had unfolded that afternoon weighed on him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a neighborly complaint would escalate into such a dramatic encounter. Yet, despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that he had handled the situation with dignity and grace. Word of what had happened quickly spread through the neighborhood. As Marcus worked on his farm, he noticed more people stopping by, some just to say hello, others to share their thoughts about the incident. They all seemed to have the same question: how had it all gotten so out of hand? At first, Marcus didn't want to make a big deal of it. He wasn't one to dwell on drama or conflict. But after a few days of running into neighbors who seemed curious or concerned, he realized that the situation had sparked a conversation, one that was bigger than just him or Carolyn. A few people mentioned that they had never seen Marcus in the same light before. To them, he had always been the quiet man with the farm, the one who kept to himself and stayed out of the way. They never knew that Marcus was an FBI agent. It was a side of him that most people didn't need to see. But now, everyone was talking about it. The quiet man, the one they all thought they understood, had shown them that there was more to him than they ever expected. Marcus knew that some of his neighbors probably felt embarrassed, especially Carolyn. She had called the police, thinking she was doing the right thing, but now, she had to face the consequences of her actions. Marcus had heard from a few other neighbors that she was no longer as vocal about enforcing the HOA rules. In fact, some of the residents had even started to distance themselves from her. Word of her mistake had spread just as fast as the news about Marcus. But Marcus wasn't interested in seeing Carolyn humiliated. He wasn't interested in revenge. The incident had unfolded the way it did, and now it was time to move on. He wasn't going to hold it over her head. If she had learned anything, it was that assumptions could be dangerous. He hoped she had gained some perspective, but he wasn't going to dwell on it. As the week went on, Marcus continued to do what he did best: work his farm. He tended to his crops, checked on his animals, and maintained the property with the same care and attention to detail he had always given it. He didn't let the incident distract him from his responsibilities. In fact, it was moments like these, when he was out in the field with the fresh air and the earth beneath him, that he felt most at peace. He wasn't bothered by the gossip or the attention. He had his work, his family, and his land. That was all that mattered. One afternoon, as he was walking back from the far side of his property, Marcus noticed a familiar figure walking toward him. It was one of his neighbors, Dave, a man who lived a few houses down and was known for being friendly but a little reserved. Dave had stopped by a few times in the past to chat about farming techniques or share advice on repairs, but Marcus had never considered them to be close friends. Still, he always enjoyed their conversations. "Hey, Marcus," Dave called out as he approached. "Got a minute?" Marcus smiled and waved. "Of course, Dave. What's on your mind?" Dave looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing after everything that happened. I know it's been a bit of a mess with Carolyn and all that." Marcus shrugged, not wanting to make a big deal of it. "I'm fine. It's behind me now." Dave nodded, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Well, the thing is, a lot of people are talking about it. Not just about the incident itself, but about you. People are surprised, you know? I mean, you're an FBI agent, and none of us had any idea." Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah, I've kept that part of my life pretty private. It's not something I go around telling people. I get it, Dave replied, looking a little uncomfortable. But I think people are starting to realize that maybe they've been too quick to judge. People like Carolyn, they think they know everything about how things should be. But they don't know the whole story. And after what happened, I think a lot of people are rethinking things. Marcus thought about Dave's words for a moment. I hope so. I've always believed in doing things the right way, but it's not always easy when people assume the worst. Dave hesitated before continuing. Well, I just wanted to say that I respect how you handled the whole thing. A lot of people would have gotten upset or tried to cause trouble, but you kept your cool. Not many people can do that. Marcus smiled and patted Dave on the back. Thanks, Dave. That means a lot to me. But I'm not looking for any praise. I just did what I thought was right. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and soon Marcus and Dave were chatting about farming again. But as Marcus walked away, he couldn't help but think about the larger picture. The way his community had reacted to the incident showed that people weren't as quick to judge anymore. At least, not as much as they had before. He wasn't sure if it was just the shock of the situation, or if they had truly learned something from it. But he knew that, in a way, the whole experience had made people rethink how they treated others. As the days passed, Marcus noticed more and more people waving as they passed by his property, offering a friendly greeting or a quick chat. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. The gossip had died down, but there was a new sense of respect in the air. People who once kept to themselves now made an effort to speak with him, and for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of belonging he hadn't quite realized he was missing. Carolyn, too, had seemed to change. Marcus had heard that she had apologized to a few of the neighbors, expressing regret for calling the police without understanding the full situation. It wasn't an easy apology, but it was a start. Marcus hadn't spoken to her directly, but he knew that the incident had taught her an important lesson. He wasn't sure how much it had changed her, but he hoped that, in time, she would come to realize that people were more than just the labels or assumptions others placed on them. For Marcus, life had returned to normal, and as the seasons passed, his farm flourished. He continued to work hard, never seeking recognition or validation from others. He had found peace in the knowledge that he had stood up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. He didn't need anyone's approval to know that he had done the right thing. And with every passing day, he felt more at ease, knowing that sometimes, it was the quiet strength of a person's character that made the biggest impact on those around them. In the end, Marcus's life returned to its peaceful rhythm. But for those who had witnessed the events unfold, they would always remember the lesson: don't judge others without knowing their full story, because you never know who you're really dealing with. The days that followed the confrontation felt different. The atmosphere around Marcus's farm seemed lighter, less tense. As he went about his usual routine, he couldn't help but notice that the neighborhood seemed to have shifted in a subtle yet noticeable way. People who had once kept their distance now smiled and waved as they passed. Neighbors who barely made eye contact with him before now stopped to chat about the weather, farming, or even the occasional local news. It was as if the entire community had gone through a transformation, one sparked by a single misunderstanding. Marcus had never intended for any of it to happen. He had just wanted to live his life, work his farm, and enjoy the quiet peace that came with it. But sometimes, life had a way of surprising you, throwing you into situations where you had to stand up for what you believed in, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. It wasn't just the neighbors who had changed. Marcus noticed the way the officers had treated him differently after learning who he really was. The initial tension in their demeanor had dissipated when they understood he wasn't just a regular farmer. They had approached him with more respect after realizing he was an FBI agent. It wasn't that he had been seeking respect or recognition, it was simply that the officers, like so many others, had jumped to conclusions about him. They had only seen a man on a farm, without knowing the full story of who he was or what he did. Despite everything, Marcus didn't hold any grudges. He wasn't the type of person to let things fester. He knew that people made mistakes, and in the case of Carolyn, she had learned a valuable lesson. He didn't expect an apology from her, but he hoped that the experience had opened her eyes to the danger of making assumptions. The world was more complicated than it seemed, and it wasn't always fair to judge someone based on appearances. Over the next week, as Marcus continued his work, he heard from several neighbors who had been directly affected by the situation. Some had expressed concern for him, while others had simply wanted to know how he was feeling after the incident. He appreciated their kindness, but he didn't want to dwell on it. His focus remained on his farm, on making sure his crops thrived and that his animals were well cared for. One afternoon, Marcus was walking across the field, checking on the crops. The sky was clear, and the sun was setting behind the hills, casting a warm orange glow over everything. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved his life on the farm. He felt connected to the earth, to the land that had supported him through so much. It was his sanctuary, his place of peace. As he walked, he spotted Carolyn in the distance, standing by the edge of his property, hesitating as if she wasn't sure whether she should approach. Marcus didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling she was coming to speak with him. After all, she had been quiet for several days since the incident, and it seemed that now was the time for her to address what had happened. Marcus paused, waiting for her to come closer. As she approached, he could see that she looked uneasy, her posture stiff. He didn't rush to speak, letting her gather her thoughts. I wanted to talk to you," Carolyn said, her voice softer than usual. She seemed different, more humble, less defensive than she had been that day when she called the police. Marcus nodded, giving her the space to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Carolyn continued. "And I realize now that I was wrong. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I should have known better than to make that call." Marcus didn't interrupt. He simply listened. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, something he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't trying to justify her actions or make excuses. She was owning up to her mistake, and that was something Marcus could respect. I let my own feelings about the neighborhood get in the way," Carolyn said, looking down at the ground. "I thought I was doing the right thing by following the HOA rules. I didn't think about how my actions might affect you. And I'm sorry for that." Marcus took a moment before responding. He had already forgiven her in his heart, but it wasn't every day that someone apologized for something like this. He didn't want to make her feel worse, but he also wanted to make sure that she understood the importance of learning from her mistake. "Apology accepted," Marcus said simply. "But you need to understand that judging someone based on what you see on the surface doesn't give you the full picture. You never know what someone's story really is until you take the time to understand them." Carolyn nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry it took something like this for me to learn that." There was a long pause between them as they both stood quietly, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only noise. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the situation had lifted. There were no more hard feelings, no more tension. It was as if they had both accepted what had happened and were ready to move forward. "Well," Carolyn said, breaking the silence, "I just wanted to let you know that I'll make sure something like this never happens again. I'll be more careful about what I say and do. I don't want to make anyone feel like they don't belong." Marcus smiled slightly. "That's all I ask. We're all just trying to live our lives. No one wants to be judged unfairly." With that, Carolyn turned and began to walk back to her house. Marcus watched her go, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected an apology, but he appreciated it all the same. And more than that, he hoped that Carolyn's lesson would stick with her. The world wasn't perfect, but sometimes, the smallest moments of understanding could make a difference. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus went back to his work. He knew that the neighborhood would likely go back to its usual rhythm soon enough, and that this incident would fade into the past. But he also knew that the lessons learned here about assumptions, respect, and understanding would stay with him for a long time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life on Marcus's farm continued as it always had. He worked hard, took care of his family, and maintained the land that had given him so much. There were still quiet moments when he reflected on what had happened, but he didn't let it consume him. He had learned that sometimes, you had to stand your ground not with anger, but with quiet strength. And sometimes, that was all it took to make a lasting difference. As for the neighborhood, it had indeed changed. People were kinder, more willing to listen, and less quick to judge. The incident with Carolyn had taught them all a valuable lesson, one that Marcus hoped would stay with them for a long time. And so, as the seasons changed and the crops continued to grow, Marcus remained the same steady, calm, and grounded in the life he had built. He had faced an unexpected challenge, but in the end, he had emerged with his integrity intact, ready to face whatever came next with the same quiet strength that had always been his greatest asset. As the months passed, Marcus couldn't help but notice how different the community felt. Things had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. The neighborhood, once tightly knit with its unspoken rules and silent judgments, seemed to have loosened up a little. People were friendlier, more open. He noticed that many of the neighbors who had once barely acknowledged his presence now made a point to wave or greet him as they passed by his farm. It wasn't just the people who had learned from the situation, Marcus himself had taken something away from the whole experience. He had always been someone who valued peace and quiet, someone who preferred to stay out of the drama and conflicts that so often tore communities apart. But now, he realized that standing up for what was right wasn't always about avoiding confrontation. Sometimes, it meant facing uncomfortable situations head-on, not with anger, but with calm strength. Marcus had never expected the events that unfolded between him and Carolyn to lead to such change. It had all started with a simple, misplaced complaint, a misunderstanding. But over time, it had turned into something more meaningful, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. One morning, Marcus was working on his crops when he saw a familiar face walking down the long path to his farm. It was Dave, the neighbor who had spoken to him a few days after the incident. Dave had always been friendly, but today he had a look on his face that suggested he had something important to say. "Hey, Marcus," Dave called out as he approached. "Got a minute?" Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Sure, Dave. What's going on?" Dave hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to start. "I just wanted to say something. About everything that happened. You know, with Carolyn and the police." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What about it?" "Well," Dave said, taking a deep breath, "I just wanted to say thank you. I know it wasn't easy, standing your ground like that. And I've heard from a lot of people that they respect how you handled it." Marcus was a little surprised. "Respect? I didn't do it for respect. I just did what I thought was right." Dave nodded. "I get that. But sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't get noticed until later. And, well, it's not just about what happened with Carolyn. It's about how it made people realize something." Marcus frowned slightly, unsure of what Dave was getting at. "What do you mean?" Dave shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "People realized how quickly we can jump to conclusions about each other. We look at someone, and based on what we see, we decide who they are. We forget that there's so much more to a person than what's right in front of us." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. It's something I've always known, but it's not always easy to live by." Well, a lot of us around here, Dave continued, we've been thinking about it. You know, about how quick we were to judge, how quick we were to believe that you were just some guy on a farm, instead of seeing the full picture. Some of us were guilty of it, too, but watching you handle everything with such calm, it made a lot of people reconsider how they treat others. It was a humbling moment for Marcus. He had always tried to live by the values of fairness, respect, and understanding, but hearing Dave's words made him realize that not everyone saw things the same way. Maybe he had been a little too quick to dismiss how deeply this event had affected the people around him. I'm glad people are thinking about it, Marcus said quietly. But it wasn't just me standing my ground. It was about understanding that none of us are perfect. Carolyn made a mistake, but that doesn't make her a bad person. We all mess up sometimes. Dave nodded, his face thoughtful. That's true. And it's not about punishing people for their mistakes, either. It's about learning from them. I think Carolyn learned a lot, and so did the rest of us. Marcus smiled, grateful for the conversation. He didn't need any kind of recognition or praise. The real reward, for him, was knowing that things had changed for the better, not just for him, but for everyone involved. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Over the next few weeks, life continued on at its usual pace. Marcus remained dedicated to his work on the farm, and although he didn't seek out attention, he noticed a shift in the way his neighbors interacted with him. More people stopped by, offering help or simply asking how he was doing. Some of them even invited him to small neighborhood gatherings, something that had never happened before. It was as though the community had grown closer, more understanding of each other's differences. The true turning point, however, came when Marcus received an unexpected visit from Carolyn. She had been quieter since the incident, but now, as she stood at his doorstep, he could see that she had something on her mind. "Hey, Marcus," she began, her voice a little hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I wanted to apologize again. I know I've said it before, but I think I owe you a more heartfelt apology. I really didn't know who you were, and I made some terrible assumptions about you." Marcus smiled gently, not wanting to make her feel worse than she already did. "Carolyn, I've already forgiven you. There's no need for more apologies. You've learned something, and that's what matters." Carolyn nodded, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes now, as if she could finally move forward. "I've been talking to some of the other neighbors, and I realize now that I've been too focused on control, on making things fit into my idea of what they should be. I'm working on changing that." Marcus was glad to hear it. He knew that change wasn't easy, especially for someone who had been set in their ways for so long. "I think we could all stand to be a little more open-minded. It's not just about following rules, it's about understanding that everyone has a different story to tell." Carolyn smiled softly. "You're right. And I promise I'll do better from now on." With that, she turned to leave, and Marcus watched her walk back toward her house. He didn't know if she would change overnight, but he hoped that, in time, she would become a more compassionate person. As for Marcus, he continued to focus on what mattered most to him, his family, his farm, and his quiet life. He had faced a difficult situation, but he had come out of it stronger, with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest strength came not from anger or confrontation, but from understanding, patience, and forgiveness. In the end, the incident with Carolyn had changed the neighborhood for the better. People had learned to be more open-minded, to treat each other with more respect, and to avoid making snap judgments. And for Marcus, that was the true reward, knowing that his actions had made a lasting impact, not just on his own life, but on the lives of those around him. The farm continued to thrive, and Marcus worked with the same quiet determination he had always had. Life had returned to normal, but it was a normal that felt a little bit better, a little bit kinder, than it had before. And that was enough for him.